everybody, and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast. I'm Jo Hickey Hall, and with me this time I have David Halpin, folklorist and researcher. And you do call yourself a hobbyist, but I I beg to differ because Circle Stories is an incredible resource. Thank you so much for what you've been doing for a great number of years now. Circle Stories on Facebook and a little bit on Instagram as well. Some teasers on Instagram too.
That's right.
And you also have the occult book review, which is excellent resource also.
Thanks very much.
So yeah, welcome and thank you very much for joining me.
It's great to be here. I've been listening to all your previous episodes, so it's great to be part of that lexicon of great guests you've had.
Oh, amazing. Well, yeah, I mean, we couldn't be doing what we're doing without what you're doing. We were actually just talking about that, weren't we? How we all
Mhm.
interlink, um what you're doing, and Kate and Neil over on Hare and the Hawthorn, and how we all kind of seem to have started up at around the same time. We were kind of called into doing what we're doing now, and how somehow it kind of all is linking together, and that we are able to, to create more as we're sort of working. We may be working individually, but actually we're working for a greater cause, if you want to call it that, that seems to
Exactly.
be coming together, and not just here, but on this side of the world, but seems to be, you know, all over the world. People are drawn to be working in these areas. So just to say a little about Circle Stories is that, you are providing their Irish folklore, it's tying into mythology, but also, a little bit of ritual practice in there too. You're pointing people in direction towards the Duchas Schools Collection as well. So there's such a richness in what you're providing. Can you talk a little bit about how that came about initially?
Sure. Well, I've been writing about, I suppose, Forteana for a long, long time, and gradually I began to notice more and more that what I was actually writing about was fairy lore, I suppose, for want of a better term, but just from hopefully new contexts and perspectives. So a lot of the old articles that I'd written and pieces I'd put forward for radio shows and so on back in the 90s, when I look back on them now, I'm like, yeah, they're very similar to what I can see now in the Dukas archives and in the old books. It's just that we had a different language and we had a different perspective. And as you mentioned there, Joe, with all of us in this area now, providing context for each other, we can reframe a lot of, well, I think anyway, we could reframe a lot of our older works and see that, do you know what, underneath the cultural contexts and the cultural lenses, we're documenting very similar experiences. So with Circle Stories, it began to grow, I suppose, with the advent of social media, because I could put up photographs of the stone circles, and I was I still am an avid hiker, although my knees are giving out a bit now. But when I was putting up photos of some of the places, the kind of less accessible places, that opened up a lot of folklore for people as well, because they were able to go onto the National Monuments database, which
Mm.
we have in Ireland, and you can look up monuments and you can see then the associated folklore, and it may come from a name, or it may come from a description, or you may be able to trace it in Dukas or in your local library archives or whatever. So basically, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go on, go. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So with Circle Stories, then I think people were fascinated because I was bringing in less of the old, I don't know, tweeness,
Mm.
and I was looking at people like Vallée and John Keel, and even Max Dashu's work, and people like that, people who had much more knowledge than I had, but I was able to look at their work and see that what I was documenting from an Irish context, you could see all around the world. And at the heart of it all is that great mystery that we're all delving into. Like, what does it all mean? Often with Irish stories, anyway, you get these hints of a context that's so much bigger, and
Mm,
it's almost like you're being encouraged to pursue that. So they're the kind of stories that I love. When I'm writing about circle stories, I love finding the fairies, or whatever name you want to put on these beings. I love when they hint at something like, like dimensionality, or
mm,
like, eternity, and how our concepts are different to something that we may grow towards. So all of that transcendental stuff, which I hadn't seen really in Irish fairy stories, I wanted to bring
yeah.
in to show, look, there's much more here than has been documented.
Absolutely, because if you focused on, say, looking at Yeats, which many people do, and I love Yeats, you might, compare and contrast to, say, McManus, and then for me, reading McManus is like, oh yeah, now,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
this is speaking to me, and I guess Yeats was writing for what people wanted then, effectively, because it was the sort of hangover of the it was, looking back at the way that people's beliefs around fairies, what they wanted to believe around fairies. They wanted the story, they wanted these yarns, but actually, um, you know, reading, say, McManus and looking at the Dukas, you're getting a bit deeper into the actual the truth of things, and you can feel it
yes, yeah.
actually when you
And also with Yeats, like some of the fairy forms you find in his work, you don't find anywhere else. So you
no,
might ask, like, where is that coming from? Is it
yeah,
actually authentic at all, or is it just something embellished, or something just added to make the story more exciting or more colorful for an audience? So we've had to deal with that. And, to a lesser extent, Wentz with the Fairy Faith book as well,
mm,
which is, I love it. And it
yeah,
has amazing stories in it and
yeah.
amazing accounts. But again, he was very swayed by his own theosophical beliefs. And you get perspectives in there that I had never seen in Irish folklore before. So again, I just wonder, like, where was that coming from?
Yeah, yeah, that's it. But I agree, the collected stories in there, especially I love the ones from the local priests.
Hmm. Hmm.
They knew a thing or two,
Yeah.
and of
Yeah,
course they do.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, of course. And
They're
like,
brilliant.
I don't want to go too down on Wentz. I mean, like you say,
Yeah,
he
he's great.
brought up stuff that was showing that a lot of people who had influence over parishes had a lot more occult and spiritual knowledge than perhaps they were allowed to convey otherwise, because
Mm.
they weren't going to go up on the pulpit and talk about this kind of stuff,
No,
but they
no.
could perhaps speak to someone like Wentz, because don't forget, it was his thesis that's what the fairy
True.
faith book
Yeah,
was. But
yeah,
yeah, like,
yeah,
so he's talking
yeah.
about divination and the gentry, and he speculates, of course, on who the fairies are, and that was very, very useful, because we didn't have to just say, okay, they're this or they're that. We got a few different explanations in that book, which people ran with then.
Yeah. No, it is a great resource if you kind of come at it, with a pinch of grain of salt, let's say.
Absolutely.
But I still love flicking through that. It's brilliant. So, are you finding with circle stories and what you're putting out to the public? I mean, first of all, you get a brilliant response. People are always commenting, people are always wanting to offer their ideas or ask questions, and there's a lot of activity going on in the comments, which is brilliant. Do you ever get people kind of contacting you and telling you their encounters that might tally with some of the folklore that you're talking about? Do you ever get that kind of
I do. I get it all the
yeah,
time, believe it or not. I've got, for every post I put up, I probably have, like, as many private messages as comments, and a lot of the time there will be people eh, literally telling me, I wouldn't say this in public, but I'm
yeah,
telling you because I don't think you'll laugh at me, that kind of thing.
yeah,
So you get
yeah.
a wide variety. You get some people who will come at you with very, what would I say, the very familiar motifs, and
Mm,
yet you'll get other people who will blow you away with something that's so strange and something totally unique that you end up going, that's something I've never heard before. But it
Mm.
comes down to, I suppose, something I've written about before, Joe, which is I think maybe in hindsight now we have to look at all the categories that we have fairies in and the types of experience. And perhaps, even though it's useful for us to compartmentalize like that, perhaps the whole ecology of it all is much wider and much more nuanced. And all of these experiences are experiences that have happened, but people themselves have felt pressured to put an encounter in a certain way so that it can be received without too much, as we say in Ireland, too much slagging off or whatever.
Mm.
So I
Mm.
think sometimes people have probably censored themselves in a way, or else allowed their
Yes.
stories to be influenced by the person they're telling the story to.
Mm.
So I'm very careful now about trying not to eliminate that peripheral strangeness and something that's perhaps a person is not used to talking about. Do you know what I mean by that?
No,
It's allowing
absolutely.
the new forms to come through, except they may not be new at all.
No, that's it's so right. I mean, there are so many layers to this, and I think that it's kind of a little bit why I tend to call everything fairy, and it's just because when I'm speaking to people about, whether it's they've seen a black dog or whether they've seen some kind of creature that is not they're not able to properly describe it, or whether they've seen what looks like a kind of humanoid figure or a smaller sized figure, or an orb which changes into something for them, whatever it is, to me, if it's an otherworldly being, I'm kind of putting it under um, the with the name of as fairy, just so that I can kind of study it all, because to me it's when you start to categorize, I think you just tie yourself up in knots. This is not how, fairies, they are paradoxical anyway. You can't really kind of pin them down. You can't really box them and categorize them like we like we did, um, with the natural world. And
Mhm.
so we have to learn another way to expand our understanding, not to try and squeeze our understanding of them, but just to allow, and not to necessarily even look for the answers so that we can say, oh yes, well, this is what we saw, but more about kind of what it feels, what effect it had on us, and yeah, the meaning behind it, really, rather
Yeah.
than having to come up with a some kind of answer to it.
It's interesting. For example, a person will say a puka, which is an Irish fairy spirit, and generally the puka is seen to be like a black horse, for example, or even a rabbit sometimes. Okay, but there's a place quite near here called Pulafuka, and the puka is said to appear as a black cat. Now that's interesting to me because if you talk to a lot of Irish folklorists, they will say the one thing that's missing generally from Irish folklore are fairy cats. And
Okay.
yet, do you know what I mean? And I'm like, wait a minute, are we not just mixing ourselves up here by trying to
Yeah.
fit these stories into particular categories instead of just letting them be? So
Yeah.
why is the puka this and not that? And why is the fairy cat not part of Irish folklore really, except when it's a puka in this part of Ireland? Then you can go, God, it's all just very, very strange. And perhaps it's something that we have a problem we have created for ourselves,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Exactly. It's stop using the kind of logic and the categorization and the rationalization to understand, and just see, see what you see, talk about it, describe how that feels to each other, and exchange stories, because it's in the kind of exchange of the stories that you start to, it may not even be something that you think about in a kind of lateral way either, but it's just more something that make starts to become more familiar, maybe. And I'm sure, like me, when you're getting these stories from people that are writing to you and you're reading the folklore, there's aspects of all these stories and encounters and folklore that then start to become familiar. There's a sense of it. It's not that you could categorize it, it's just a sense. Ah, okay,
Yes,
yeah, I've
yes,
kind of
yeah.
felt this before. So yeah, we do need to kind of feel into it more rather than using our, logic.
It's funny. You were mentioning. I think I'm not sure whether it was the last podcast or one before that. You were talking about owls. Do you
Okay.
remember that? And you were just talking about how Mike Clellan, is that the guy
Oh yeah.
who had written about owls and so on? And owls are, people would generally have a sense, especially with the Cailleach here in Ireland, who is kind of our winter type goddess associated with the owl. The owl is known as a wise creature that comes maybe as a portent of death sometimes, but
Mm.
generally seen in a good way. And yet, in the Dukas archives, there's a great story of a fairy woman who turns into an owl, and yet she captures young children. Do you
Oh,
know? And so it's a totally different role. And at the end of the story, there was a way, using a purple flower, you could bypass her magic and release the person who you thought had been captured by her. Now, being captured by a fairy, as you know, is it can be physical or it can be mental. So, but I just thought that was an interesting reversal of that owl motif, and just links into what you were saying there.
yeah, that's amazing. I'd love to have a look at that one. I hadn't heard that one before. And interesting that it's purple too, because that itself has links with other world. Sort of thinking about, chakras and the kind of connection, the crown, violet with the all, and so that being that kind of like threshold from material into another realm. So that's quite, yeah, that's, I'd like to know more about that, and thank you also for kind of bringing in there about the inclusion of children in some of these encounters, and that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about today, because I get contacted by people who tell me about their childhood encounters, and I wanted to ask you about the Irish folklore in relation to children's encounters. Now, I know there are some in McManus's Middle Kingdom. In fact, there's some really brilliant ones. Quite nice chunk of them in there. And I have seen some in Ducas as well. But yeah, I wondered if you could tell us about the inclusion of childhood encounters. Now, of course, we're not talking here about changeling folklore, which is you'd have to have
Hmm.
an entire other show to talk about that. But
Definitely.
yes,
Yeah. So well, first of all, if you've followed circle stories for a long time, you'll know that like have always brought my daughters to stone circles and ancient places, and often people will scold me for that and say, "What are you doing, bringing your children to a stone circle? What kind of father are you? Do you not know it's so dangerous?" and so on. But I have to say, like, we've never felt any, what would I say, bad vibes or dark energy or anything like that. It's always been a very welcoming experience, and
yeah,
I think for most people, I think that's the case. But we've been going since they were babies all the way up to now, and we've always had good experiences. So that, just let me say that first of all.
yeah,
Now, when it comes to children within folklore, apart from changelings, there are stories of children being taken by the fairies, and that's part of, I suppose, the catalogue of fairy stories all around the world. And it
mm,
doesn't have that, they don't necessarily have dark endings to these stories, by the
no,
way.
no, no,
I
that's
should
right.
say as well.
Yeah,
Um, Close to where I live, there's a mountain called Cadine, and there's a place called Rusty Duff there. And if you look it up, Rusty Duff in the Dukas archives, you can find some strange stories there. But there was one particular one which caused quite a scandal, where a girl was taken, went missing for 3 days,
oh
and when
yeah,
when when she came back, she said she was taken by small beings. And after that, then there was a great term where the locals would say she was in the fairy, or with the fairies, even though she was back physically
yeah,
with her parents and the community. And she was looked at then as someone who was always living on the threshold of the two worlds, if you like, and that's a simplification in terms of a division, but you know what I mean, the human world and the fairy world, whatever your definition of the fairy world is. But it reminded me then of some of the work of Dr. Eva Pox, which I've written about before. She specializes in Eastern European and Balkan folklore. And what I noticed there was the exact same taboos take place. You know, when you're taken by the fairies, you accept that this is happening. And then when you return, you may be asked to be a healer, you may be asked to be a prophet or whatever. And the the bad ending tends to come when you refuse that gift, and when you try to walk away from this opportunity that you've been given, you've been chosen for a particular reason. So it's very like shamanism in a way, especially in some of the I suppose Eastern European shamanism again, where you're given this gift and the sickness comes about when you walk away from it, you know. So in Irish folklore, then you have people who are taken, and then they come back, and sometimes actually I should just mention, sometimes someone is brought back and they're given the evil eye, which is a terrible affliction, and bad luck befalls people then who are around this person. That's something else entirely. But there seems to be a whole area then. I don't know if you're familiar with Cillíni or Cilín. So
Ah.
so Cillíns are places where unbaptized children
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, yeah. That,
were
yeah,
buried.
outside.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the reason for that was they might have been born out of wedlock, or maybe a criminal or someone that wasn't known in the community, or a person who took their own life or whatever.
Yeah.
So they were put on unsanctified ground. They weren't allowed to be buried on church grounds. But a lot of the times they would be buried around a fairy fort. So with this came the belief that it was better to be with the fairies, because from the Christian context, the fairies were neither bad enough for hell nor good enough for heaven, in this liminal place. So again, there was a strong association then with the children who were buried there, and they're linked to the fairies. And the parents had solace because they knew that the fairies were looking after their children.
Yeah.
So there's always been this bond, I think, although because it's such a taboo area, and you have to be sensitive about it, I don't think it's been highlighted very much. But there's this, the fairies also exist in this place where they accept grief, and they seem to be able to provide a place for parents to go to know that their children are okay. And that was something that I found very interesting. Um, Beside us, there's a Colleen, and it's known to be haunted by a woman in white. Now, the woman in white was, for some people, she's a ghost, and for others, she's a banshee. But it's interesting because a banshee generally wouldn't be known as a psychopomp, but in this context, it's almost like there's a guardian spirit of this place, a place where these unbaptized children were buried, and it's a woman in white. And I found that very interesting. If you could link that to La Llorona, of course, who was said to, walk around looking for the children that she lost. In some stories, there's a similar story in Eastern European folklore. Sorry, in the Grimm's folklore, where they collect the story again of a woman in white who's lost children. So that motif is very interesting, except in here, it's a very, very real thing, because this is a place where these children are, and they're buried, and we have this guardian almost looking after them. So it's a very complicated area when you talk about children and fairies.
Yeah, I'm interested in what you mentioned there about the little girl who got taken. Is this the one that was taken by Little Red Men? Was it Little
That's
Red
right.
Men? Yeah.
Yes, yes, yeah, yeah.
It's a great story, and
It is, yeah.
and yeah, and didn't they say afterwards that she kind of she remained a fool or something like that. So they were saying that she was different
There's actually
afterwards. That
no. Do you know what's really interesting about that story is you can find it being told by different people, and it's the same story, and it's all within the Duca's archives. You just have to look into different place names that surround that area, but you'll get
right.
different people, so you can see that the story was real and was known by people not just in the immediate vicinity, but known by people outside the town as well, which gives it that it's definitely something that happened, and it was definitely something that was believed.
Yeah, yeah. There was another one that I found, and you'll know this one too, I'm sure. But this was, and it really, reading this, I actually started to research to see if I could find somebody that still lived there that might know this story. So I don't know if anyone's watching this that they might know. But this was in the parish of Castle Magna. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Castle Magna?
Magna, okay, yeah, yeah,
Castle Magna. There lived a child who, with other children, attended the local schools. On the way, they had to pass a fairy fort. One morning, a fairy woman came to the road and asked the child to come in and mind her baby for a short time. So I know this starts to sound like, oh, this is just, a story, but
yeah, yeah.
let's hold on. The child went in and spent the day minding the fairy baby in the fairy fort. The same occurred daily, and after some time, the teacher complained that the child was not attending school. On inquiring, the mother discovered what was happening. She told the child to ask the fairy woman for a bottle to cure a sick cow. You'll be picking up all of these motifs. The child did as she was directed, and when she brought the bottle, her mother washed her with the liquid which the fairy woman supplied. Next morning, when the child appeared at the fairy fort to spend her day as usual, the fairy woman sent her away saying, "Your mother is too clever for me." Now, this is the bit that makes me think that there's something in this. The
Yeah.
child never again entered the fairy fort, but was always known afterwards as the fairy child and later the fairy woman. So there's this woman living in the community that people are still talking about.
Hmm.
She used to be the fairy child. When she grew up, she is the fairy woman. So as you were just saying before, once they've had a brush with this encounter, and they walk away different, they accept whatever it
Yeah.
is. And
Yeah.
in that story, she literally talks about accepting the invitation of the fairy woman to do her bidding and aid with the fairy child. But this sounds like, to me, I mean, maybe I'm just imposing my great wish for this to be a real story. But it to me, there's kind of something about it that feels like the community is telling us something about this being a true story. It seems that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think with some people, they feel that they shouldn't say what has happened to them because they feel that they're breaking some kind of contract, if you
Yeah.
like. And
Mm.
yet, with others, they feel like they need to say what it is. And it's, you can look at, say, for example, being given a fairy tune by the fairies, and sometimes the fairies will tell the person that you're not to let anyone else
Mm.
know what you're playing on. But coming back to children, you have to take into account, I suppose, what we know now, and perhaps that maybe our ancestors didn't know as much, and that is like as biology changes, as your metabolism changes, you're open to frequencies at a certain time in your life, and you're not open to them as you get older. So perhaps there's a window where perception and these experiences are more available to you naturally, as
Yeah.
opposed to having to cleanse yourself and go through some type of ritual behavior as an adult in order to gain. You're not going to have that kind of spontaneity. Do you know
Mm.
what I mean?
Mm.
And you
Mm.
see that
Yeah.
almost even in, say, stories by Alan Garner, for example, with the owl service. You have these teens going through puberty, sexual awakening, their hormones are raging, and somehow that, you might argue, I know there are different interpretations of the book, but it seems to be, this awakens something mythic in the landscape, and the story is played out over and over again.
Yeah.
So all of these stories are telling us that at certain times we may awaken a connection, and become a conduit to something that needs to burst free and uh, relive and regenerate over and over again. And that's kind of the basis of the owl service anyway. But I think that may happen over and over again when children go to sites, because it's difficult for people to believe what they say, but children will say, "Oh, I saw something over there
Mm,
when you weren't looking, and there was a man waving to me," or
mhm,
whatever. And we as adults will go, "Oh yeah, okay, well that's great." And you wonder then, oh, it's just that I said to them we're going to a stone circle and they might see the fairies
mm.
and so on. But perhaps, there's a frequency response that we don't have anymore. And you hear that mentioned, of course, if with people who are into paranormal investigation, when they talk about animals, again, the same thing. They have a different frequency response, and so can
Yeah.
experience things that we as adult human beings can't. So all of that is interesting too, and it's very hard to lay something down definitively that can be replicated because you only have this window. Do you know?
Yeah, it's true. And I should say actually, I have always taken my kids to to go into. I used to drag them off to the spring and autumn equinox at sort of silly o'clock in the morning. It's nighttime, and I'm taking them into Dolmens and
Yeah,
to
yeah,
watch
yeah,
the
yeah. Same
first
here.
light rise.
Same
So,
here. Yeah,
and
yeah,
they might have grumbled at the time, but they love the fact that they did it now.
yeah.
And
But
it
but
does, yeah.
just staying on that for 1 second, Joe. Sorry to
Mm.
interrupt you.
No,
I
no,
just
go,
wanted
go.
wanted to mention a particular what would I say, a custom of
Mm,
sorts around here,
mm,
and there's a place called Kilranla, and there's a spring, as you
mm.
mentioned springs earlier on. There's a spring there, but Kilranla is also a graveyard with a lot of children buried there, and it's also arguably Ireland's uh, oldest graveyard because it has ancient stones that seem to have belonged to monuments nearby. There's stone circles nearby.
Oh,
Kilranla Hill, you can
right.
look it up.
Yeah,
There's also a place where it's also an ancient pagan site.
yeah.
But what's really interesting is parents used to leave cups at the spring, and the reason for the cups was so that the ghosts of their children who had been buried could offer a drink of water to the spirits that were already residing there.
Oh, that's lovely.
Now,
Yeah.
that's a really, it's a beautiful anecdote, but it's also a great, I suppose, um, microcosm of that transition from the paganism to Christianity on that particular site. Do you know what I mean? Not that the paganism is gone. It's living. It's still there,
Yeah.
and it speaks to that. But it shows that the undercurrent of that Christianity was still the pagan beliefs, and I find that really beautiful and poignant, of course, as well. But I just was reminded of that story.
Mm, that is really beautiful, and that's to this day that you will find the cups there.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Now
Yeah.
the people, the graveyard now is like I said, very old, and I'm not sure how many burials take place there anymore. It's actually up a mountain, very hard to get to. But that was the tradition.
Mm. And this open kind of back and forth with the other world like that, this expectation that that is, at some level a kind of normality in a culture,
Mhm.
I think that's very encouraging. And even, that story that I just read, on you've got the mother who and I'm not saying that everything happened in the story as it did, that she, you know, that the ointment was involved and all this kind of thing. But the idea that there was a back and forth, that she encouraged her child to go back and kind of outwit the
Yeah,
fairy
yeah,
in order to achieve her freedom from the fairy fort, if you like, that
yes, yeah,
there was an entering
yeah,
in
yeah,
to enter out again. And then of course she was ever changed. But just that sense that, a lot of people, not everybody, because I'm sure like everywhere else, we're all losing our beliefs in these areas as people get older and pass on, and the modern world just whizzes everybody way too fast nowadays. But to know that there are still people in the community that will leave cups there, that will tell these stories still, is very, very encouraging to me. And I don't know about you, but are you finding that, because I'm finding that people are becoming more interested again? Do you think there is more of an interest in what you're doing within Ireland? Are people within Ireland actually really getting interested again in
Yeah, yeah.
these stories again?
I could say again, but maybe it never went. Maybe it's just the fact that I'm in this area now and I'm getting to be the place. I'm getting to hear the stories that people may not have told many people before. Because
Yeah,
I find that's really, there are probably so many stories lost because people were afraid to say them.
definitely.
I told this story before. I'm not sure if you or your listeners heard it, but I was going for a walk, and this lady came up to me, an elderly lady, and she said, are you the guy that writes about the fairy stories? And I said, oh, yeah, yeah. And she said, I want to tell you about my father. And I said, okay, what's the story? And so we have a local fairy fort here, and she said when her father was a boy, well, but when he was sorry, not when he was a boy, when he was a young husband, his family were quite poor, and he needed more money. So the story was that there was treasure in the fairy fort if you could dig it up. So he
Mm,
decided to break all taboos and go and look for it. Anyway, he was digging away and he couldn't find the entrance into it. But when he looked up at one particular point, there are crows everywhere, and he decided that was a bad omen, and he just left it and went home. But when he got home, he started to bleed from his eyes. And
yeah,
that happened all night. And then the next morning he was okay, but he took that as a warning, and it was a real embarrassment to him because he told his family, but he wouldn't tell anyone in the community because he had committed a transgression, of course,
mhm,
but also he was embarrassed that he had been reduced to doing something like that. And
mm,
yet you have that almost supernatural element, if you like, because the crows coming as a warning, and
yeah,
then the blood from his eyes. And of course, as you would know, anyone that meddles with fairies or
yeah,
fairy force, the eye is a real motif that's taken as an example of you shouldn't have been doing that. You lose an eye for certain. Sometimes, like
yeah,
Odin, for example, you might lose an eye for looking for wisdom, but sometimes you might lose your sight for just going to a fairy fort at dusk on the equinox and you didn't have steel in your pocket or whatever.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that was an
that's it.
interesting one. And if I didn't meet her on that path, she wouldn't have told me that story, and that would have just been been gone. But it was another story then now that I can add to the folklore of this particular area.
That's fantastic. And are you cataloging these stories then? Are you sort
Yeah,
of
yeah.
collecting them?
Yeah, like I have a lot of stories here. Like, it's just time. It's
I
just
know,
time. Even doing circle stories can be tough. To get out a certain amount of articles per month or whatever.
yeah.
But yeah, look, there's a project on the computer, and I don't know whether it will ever get finished. But it's being added to at irregular intervals, shall we say?
It would be fantastic if it turns into a book at some point, because it would
Yeah,
be a
yeah.
massive
Hopefully,
book
hopefully. Yeah.
because
Well, that's it.
you've created so much, but it would be really wonderful. And I know I've kind of kept you a little while, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the stories in the Duchess. A lot of them involve where, I mean, in some of the tales where they have gone past, usually a man at night going past a fairy fort and rescuing a child from a fairy
Hmm.
fort and bringing them home with them, and it kind of, there's kind of echoes of the sorts of tales that my dad used to tell me about, a child going out and getting lost in a fairy fort and needing to eventually find their way home after they've had an adventure with the fairies. Has anybody ever contacted you and said that they themselves had any kind of encounter in a fairy fort?
Yeah, like quite a few people, and as well as that, fields as well. There's certain fields that are known to be haunted, and what's interesting about that is if you go on to the monuments database, you can find sites where so many fairy forts were destroyed. So people may enter a field and not know that it was a
Yeah,
fairy fort. So
yeah,
what that speaks to is the fact that whatever it is that designates it as a magical place still seems to exist even as the physical landscape itself has been changed or altered or destroyed, that
yeah,
that
yeah.
resonance of something is still there. So what's interesting to me about that is if we look at these places as magical or places where probably rituals took place, because certainly at the stone circles we can see evidence of that type of what would I say, behavior, if you want to term it like that. But what's interesting is when we associate these places with the other world and timelessness, then I often wonder, is it that
Mm.
something has been triggered and it's creating a feedback? And so that magical energy, whatever you want to call it, is still resonating throughout time. So it means that when people go there, there's no shut off, there's no, like after a ritual, there's a closing of a circle, for example. Yeah, when these places are dug up and knocked down, is it reopening something? Like
Mm.
it's all just speculation, but it's interesting, and it may explain why people do have experiences at places where it's only later they find out there used to be a stone circle there. There used
Yeah.
to be a dolmen there. There was a fairy fort there. Like
Yeah.
across behind me here, across the field, there's an expanse, and I'll send you a photo of it tomorrow. And it's a it's like an area in the field where there are lots of dents, and I was like looking at it, going, "That's kind of weird." So I
Mm.
looked up the National Monuments database, and lo and behold, there used to be a fairy fort there,
Oh,
and
wow.
it was plowed over. But
Wow.
you can still see the shadow when the sun comes down at a certain angle. You can see the boundaries, what's left of them.
Yeah.
But coming back to to your question, yes, there's a place here called Ring of the Rath or Rathgal, and it's known very much as a fairy place. And even to this day, people go there who want to conceive.
Mm.
They will go there, and the idea is they can do the deed or they can sleep over at this place, and the fairies may bestow that gift upon them. It's also associated with musicians who want to sleep there at certain times of the year and to become better, again
Mm.
to receive the gift of the fairies. But um, I suppose what's interesting about that is people are still going. That's I'm
Yeah.
still. It's You can go there, and sometimes you can go there, and you could see someone, and you go, "Oh God, I've just
Yeah.
interrupted. I've interrupted. Shouldn't be here."
Yeah.
And you go. So that folklore is a living thing. It's still happening. So people will often come back then and send me stories about, I was at this place. I heard a noise, or I saw a horse. The horse wandered behind a tree, and it's impossible, I know, but the horse disappeared as it went behind the tree, and things like that.
Mm.
So a
Mhm.
lot of these are very, um, sometimes they're quite subtle experiences in that there's no big
No.
show off
No.
ending to them. It's just something that nudges a person to think differently, maybe. And maybe that's,
Mm.
it's like what we were talking about before we went on air about breadcrumbs and so on.
Mm.
Maybe that's what those experiences are. They don't always have to be the UFO on the White House lawn type of thing.
No. No.
It's just something that's personal, you know.
Yeah. And
Other,
again to you, sorry, go on. Sorry.
other people will tell me things which cross over in terms of supernatural and the afterlife. They'll say that they went to a stone circle and they heard their father's voice who'd passed away and said something. They just heard, I know, they'll say something like, "I know you won't believe me, but I heard my dad say everything will be okay."
Mm.
And that's all they heard, and that's all it was. And to me, that might be just something okay, but to them, that's the biggest thing that they could get.
Mm.
So all of these things are still happening all of the time. And I think why people feel okay contacting me about these things is maybe they just want to tell someone else
Yeah.
that. And,
So
so
yeah. No, that's so true. It's so true because in sharing it with you, it's kind of acknowledging it. Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
I've spoken it
absolutely.
out loud, I've acknowledged it, and that's a really, to have that witnessed and heard is very important. So
Yeah, yeah.
no, that's really good.
And
And
I think it's another context for fairy lore when we take it on a deeper level, because after all, it is something that is a spiritual um what to say, I don't want to say movement, but it's a spiritual pathway or an opening in itself. So it
Oh, this is
uses
it.
these forms,
Hmm.
and these forms are prodding us along. But of course, what they seem to want us to know is that there's something much bigger than ourselves and much bigger than where we are. And of course, oftentimes fairies get a bad rap for, I don't know, scolding us, or we may do something to annoy them. But there's also the other side of that as well, where
Mm.
they bestow real, uh, I don't know, numinous knowledge
Yeah,
upon us and allow us to take a step forward,
yeah.
past maybe a barrier or a grief or some hurt that we couldn't get past.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what you mentioned before about, that the idea of the invitation. So whether that is, seeing the horse going behind the tree, whether that is hearing your father's name, then that's an invitation. Here is an opportunity to see the world, to change your perspective about what you believe about the world, and yes, step through.
Mhm.
And at the same time, when you said about, that if people don't accept that invitation, then they kind of become ill. I can understand that because you are denying what is true. You are
Exactly,
denying what is
exactly.
true for you, and for different people it'll be different things. But if you're denying your own truth, that just causes tension, and you can understand how illness then develops. So
Exactly,
it's like,
and I think as well, we maybe sometimes dwell on the fact that we see it as the fairies giving us the illness, but perhaps it's not them giving us the illness; it's
yeah,
us not
it's
going
us that's
forward.
ill.
That's
Yeah, it's
so
us that's the mismatch.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So
Yeah, and you were mentioning about. I love the idea of the fact that just because these monuments aren't still there visible in the landscape, but for sure the power is still there in the landscape. And there's what did they put them there in the first place because that power was in the landscape, or did they create the power in the landscape by putting the monument there? We don't know, but I agree with you because people that have stuff going on in their homes, for instance, that they might attribute to poltergeists or ghosts
mhm.
or fairies. And the first thing, look at the landscape. Okay, there's nothing on the old maps. Look at the other sacred sites that are around. If there's two sacred sites either side and it looks like you're on some kind of line, or there's a potential, it looks likely that there was a monument there, then it definitely gives you a clue. And the sense of the kind of timelessness also ties in with some research that Paul Devereaux is doing
I was
in
just about to mention Paul
ah
Dameron. There's a synchronicity for you.
yeah,
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 because
yeah.
were you thinking of the role rights?
I
He
wasn't. I was just thinking about his idea of fairy paths through the air, and he talks about the places that are connected that don't seem to be connected, and
yeah,
yet if a house or something is built in between these places, sometimes it's a bit like fairy paths. It's almost the same thing. I think he calls them spirit roads,
yeah.
but it's that kind of energetic pathway that you're in the way of
In the
sometimes.
way, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
no, for
yeah.
sure. But he mentioned that at the Rollrights stones, which I think are in Oxfordshire, if I'm not mistaken, then he was saying that they were measuring the magnetism of the stones there and the radiation. It was one of the two. I've got a feeling it was the magnetism at
Mhm.
Rollrights, but I could be wrong. He was going about different sites measuring both. And all sorts of strange things were happening there. But one of the strange things that happened was that one of the people that were kind of keeping an eye on the site suddenly one day saw the whole environment change, and this old uh, caravan, like an old gypsy caravan, kind of going up the lane, and as if it were over 100 years ago. There was a sense of it was very, very very much situated in that time. And yes, the landscape changing, and I believe there was a kind of strange sound to it as well.
Okay.
And then all of a sudden, it kind of flicked back. So these environments, they hold some kind of power or timelessness or portal. We kind of use different words to try and understand what it
Hmm.
is, but there's definitely, at least at some points, there's something going on. And whether it is the magnetism in stone, and I believe that the ones that he was researching, he found that oftentimes there'll be a completely different volume of magnetism or within the circle than outside, and that happened time and time again. It happened at so many different sites, whether it was stronger in the middle and weaker on the outside, or stronger on the outside and weaker in the middle. So what we don't know what they were being used for, but they were certainly being used for something, whether it was healing
Yeah,
or connection or yeah, ritual. Obviously, we
yeah,
just don't
yeah.
know, but
And
it's still there.
it's so funny. Um, I must start to keep a diary of when I go to stone circles, because sometimes I can go to a particular circle and come away totally energized, and sometimes I can go and come away totally drained. And you're going,
Yeah,
what's going on there? Like, it's obviously it's
yeah,
almost like it's breathing. Sometimes it's breathing out, sometimes it's breathing in. And if you go at the right time, you take in the energy. You go at the wrong time, the energy is taken from you almost. That's just speculation, of course, but it
mm.
seems like that.
Wow, I love that idea. That really speaks to me. Yeah, I can, and I guess they did you say that you journaled them and you
No,
what
no,
time
I,
of year?
don't- I
Right.
was just saying I must. I
Yeah.
must look at like moon cycles. I
Yeah.
I do a bit of it, basically basic stuff in terms of like going, if it's just the solstice or cross quarter days, or I'll have a look to see if there's some auspicious, I don't know, event, or whatever. And other times I'll just go because I'm passing by. I happen to live beside a few different stone circles, so it's not a case that I I'm choosing not to write it down. It's just that I
Yeah,
pass by so often. It's
exactly.
just you know. But
Yeah, yeah.
it's interesting again, linked to that, the idea of hyper objects, which are these huge. The speculation of these. We're part of these. I don't know what would you say, events that are so big that we can't take everything in. So
Mm.
therefore, we're only able to understand or perceive or measure a very small amount. So we're trying to understand something that's so incomprehensible to us, and
Yeah,
yet
yeah.
perhaps we won't be able to. It's like
Mm.
I think it's a Japanese word, yugen. Do you know that word? I think it's
No.
yugen. And it's basically a way to describe something that's totally indescribable. It's like
Okay.
you feel like you belong, and yet you don't know why you belong. And it's like a word trying to describe a relationship and time to the universe at that moment. It's like this sense of knowing something and not quite knowing it. It's like you're on the periphery of
Yeah,
awakening, and yet then it's just fleeting, and you're back to
yeah.
normality again.
Oh, I can definitely, I've had that feeling before where
Hmm.
it's tantalizing and almost you kind of feel it in your body almost sometimes. The sense of it's like an extra sense that we've lost touch with. That's what
Yeah,
it feels
exactly,
like. It
exactly.
feels like whether, yeah, it's, yeah, I know what you mean. And
Perhaps,
that's a really great
perhaps
word.
perhaps it's still there, and it's hopeful that we do even have these feelings. Perhaps it's just the obstacles of everyday modern life that's like
Yeah,
like a skin separating us from that connection, and yet the fact that it's prodding away there shows that it's not too far away. It's always
yeah,
accessible somehow. Perhaps we just have to, yeah, I don't know, adjust our electromagnetic radiation or our diet or our stress levels, and we can be in touch with it and connected again.
I hope so. And I guess, so much has been lost over the centuries. And you think about, well, why don't people talk about this anymore? Because you know, they were told not to.
Of course, yeah.
They were, tortured and murdered, if they did, in all around the world in various situations. So it's no wonder that we censor ourselves in talking about these things because
Hmm.
that's what that's the playbook that gets rolled out time and time again, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah, yeah,
So, maybe it's that kind of that restraint of that, if it is an extra sense, just the restraint over time and over generations, it just becomes dormant in some way. But
yeah,
it's
yeah.
still, I believe, I agree with you that it is still there, and that I think that, talking about the experiences, looking at the folklore, speaking to people, especially the older generation, as much as possible while we can too, just because there's these little kind of glimmers and these glimpses of the way that we were, and there is a possibility just for rescuing some of that before it's too late too, but actually bringing it through ourselves in the way that we're doing now into this time. So yeah, I'm
Exactly.
hopeful like you. I am very hopeful. But well, thank you so much, David. I
Thank you,
could
Joe. It was a
talk
great,
to you.
great chat.
Yeah, really great chat. I'm feeling really energized now. and, uh, and I wish that I had a fairy fort near me, like you do. Our closest uh, sacred spot, if you like, is Stanton Drew, which is a 20-minute drive from here. But
Okay.
it's so rich where you are, and if I was over there now, I think I'd go off skipping outside somewhere just to just to kind of soak in the magic that you're surrounded with there. But
Well,
I would
soak is the right term, as it's very stormy and rainy
ah
outside at the moment.
okay, maybe go there in meditation on this occasion then, rather than going out there physically. But well,
Yeah,
yeah, thanks again, and it would be
no
great
worries.
to have you back another time to chat some more.
Love that.
Yeah, good luck also with your continuation of your excellent project of circle stories too, and I will post a link to that, and I really hope that it does, you know, present itself in a book at some point. I'm sure you could put various volumes out, and we'd be eagerly
I
awaiting each
know, I know,
volume.
I
So
know.
you could
Yeah, yeah.
do that. But yeah, I look forward to it. Okay, well, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Speak soon.
Thanks a million, Joe. Thanks for
Excellent.
having me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.